Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rehana. Thank you so much for the absolute blow up on the socials this week, especially TikTok. The interaction has been interesting and fun to look at. It's been heartwarming to see how many people wanting to share and know about these wonderful women and men. Conversation was really high on the David Stuurman post, which I found very interesting, and everybody wanting to claim him. I'll say what I said under the post as I saw these conversations going on. He is a part of all of us. I see a lot of people speaking about the Krill clan and speaking about him not being colored, but Xhosa, and that there's a lot of Xhosas that are Stuurmans, but there are a lot of coloreds that are also Stuurman. And I don't mean to make light of it. I think what I want to get across is that he's ours to claim, every one of us. And we should proudly do it. We spoke about how with the colored and the Afrikaans, how these surnames appeared across groups. This is probably one I didn't look at and find. Thank you so much for everybody who contributed, that it runs across colored and Xhosa groups. He's all of ours to claim and proudly speak about his fight, because it speaks to who we are as a people, both. Okay, and thank you so much for watching the content. Moving on. This week we're moving on to after 1838. From a timeline perspective, we are moving forward post-emancipation in 1838 and looking at the next 100 years. We'll be talking through significant events that shaped our lives and significant people during this period. From 1838 to the mid-1800s, there was the Cat River settlement. On the Freeburger and Free Huguenot episode, I mentioned at the end, and I spoke about Hermanus Matruus, or this is his actual name, and I don't want to mess it up, so I'm just going to play my husband's pronunciation. So much better at this than I am. It's a little bit disturbing. But anyway, if you go back to that episode, I give like a whole breakdown how he was an interpreter. He later went to the Cat River, where he led a force of 900 Xhosa and Monikoi during the resistance war against the British. So now we're just talking about the area as a whole. Cat River was established in 1829. It became a home for a large number of freed slaves and colored settlers. Over the 1830s and 1850s, tensions with colonial authorities, frontier wars, produced episodes of resistance, persecution, and dispossession of the Cat River inhabitants. Mission station and communal life became a locus of political and social organization for colored and Khoi people. During this time, they resisted through armed defense in frontier war, legal petition, migration to mission stations, and the formations of self-governing village communities, kraals, that protected members from the farm-based control. Cat River set patterns. Attempts at communal autonomy were repeatedly undermined by legal persecution, land loss, and policing, shaping later strategies of seeking refuge in mission settlements and forming social networks, distinct colored social networks that balance subsistence, wage labor, and political organization. This week, somebody mentioned on the socials, when am I going to do mission stations? And I've put together a whole lot of information as a starting point as I start to dig into things. And I hadn't actually realized that this one was going to include it. So thank you. So let's look at the mission stations. The mission stations were established by Christian missionary societies from the late 18th century onward. What were their purpose? To Christianize and civilize, what is that word? Indigenous and enslaved population, offering religion, literacy, and sometimes protection from settler exploitation. They were spread across the Cape Colony and the frontier. What were their significance post-emancipation? It provided safe havens for freed slaves. After emancipation, many freed slaves faced poverty, lack of land, and exclusion from the settler society. So the mission stations offered land, housing, and a community life away from the settler farms. Though still under missionary oversight, mission land often provided a rare chance for colored and Khoisan people to own or farm collectively. We won't talk about the fact that the Khoisan were the original people and that the land was theirs anyway. Okay. This autonomy helped preserve dignity and some independence. The mission schools were amongst the first to provide formal education to ex-slaves and their children. Literacy empowered many to challenge colonial injustice through petitions and court appeals. This cultural and religion identity created a sense of community between these disparate groups of freed slaves of Asian, African, and European descent, as well as Khoisan survivors. Christianity became a shared identity marker for many in the colored community. It is still very strong in the community. Missionaries sometimes defended Khoisan and freed slaves against settler abuse. One of these individuals was Dr. John Philip, who lobbied tirelessly in London and Cape Town to abolish restrictions which included being forced to carry passes, the good old pass system, being forced to be tied to farms, and unable to move freely. His advocacy contributed to Ordinance 50, 1828, which gave Khoisan and other free people of color legal freedom of movement without needing a pass, the right to choose the employer, shocker, and legal recognition as free persons in the colony. This was groundbreaking and the first legislation in the Cape recognizing equality for non-Europeans. In theory, as we always find out if we just dig a bit. Under his leadership, mission stations like Bethelsdorp, Genadenal, and Mamre grew into vital centers of colored and Khoisan community life. Philip often represented Khoisan and colored complainants against settlers in colonial courts. There are some critics on his contribution and how far he got, but I contest given where he came from, his upbringing. He did a lot to contribute to literacy and inspiring non-Europeans to claim citizenship and dignity. Mission-educated leaders later became activists against racial oppression and land disposition. What is the significance for colored communities? The mission towns became strongholds of colored identity. Talking about Genadenal and Peniel, education allowed entry into trades, teaching, and clergy, which wasn't allowed on the settler farms. Mission stations were melting pots where diverse descendants of slave, Khoisan, and Europeans formed family networks through intermarriage and creating those community roots. While framed in Christian terms, mission stations inadvertently preserved aspects of Khoisan and slave histories within the colored communities. Apart from Dr. John Philip, and we're focusing on the period post-1838, these are other impactful people connected to the mission stations. There was Reverend Theo Soga. He was the first Black South African ordained minister educated through missionary influence. This was how mission education empowered leadership across racial groups. He was of the Amaxhosa. Then you had Abraham Esau from Calvinia. He was a colored blacksmith educated through mission influence who became a political leader during the Anglo-Boer War, standing for justice for colored people. So, the legacy. What I've spoken about now has been very positive. They provided land, education, and community after slavery. They were seedbeds of colored identity and resistance to racism. They also carry deep contradictions. Their dark history lies in how they both protected and controlled communities, often in ways that reinforce colonial power rather than dismantle it. Let's talk about this dark history surrounding mission stations. Missionaries often saw African and slave descendant traditions as heathen or uncivilized. Indigenous Khoikhoi, Nama, and slave Creole languages were replaced by Dutch or Afrikaans or English in church and schools. Rituals, dances, and ancestral traditions were demonized, so those spiritual practices were banned. We do know people did this outside of the gays, but they were banned. This created a lasting loss of indigenous culture, leaving Christianity as the imposed identity anchor. Mission stations had strict rules. They had curfews, bans on alcohol, compulsory church attendance, and enforced work schedules. Freed slave and Khoisan often had limited autonomy. They had to live under the authority of missionaries rather than be fully independent communities. This mimicked the settled control with just a softer form. While mission stations gave people farms, the land ultimately still belonged to the mission society, not the residents. So when the churches or governments sold or reclaimed the land, the communities often lost their homes again. Instead of fostering true independence, mission stations often created dependency. People relied on missionaries for food, jobs, land, and even permission to marry or leave. Mission trade laborers were often funneled. This got me. Mission-trained laborers were often funneled back into the colonial farms as more disciplined and Christianized. Probably used civilized and they didn't want to say it. Whew. Missionaries often positioned colored and Khoisan communities as different from African groups, encouraging them to identify more with Christianity or Europeanness rather than the broader African struggles. Can you see what's happening? This deepened racial divisions between these two communities, which the state exploited and exploited again later on. And still today, we live with the scars of what they did. Some missionaries genuinely defended indigenous and colored rights. Example, I spoke about earlier, John Philip, but others aligned with the colonial administrators. Mission stations would often serve as buffers between settlers and indigenous resistance movement, pacifying community through religion instead of rebellion. What they would do was they would encourage the armed resistance, teaching them patience and humility and just to wait for justice, which didn't benefit the resistance, only the settlers. To sum that all up, you have a loss of original language and traditions. Your community was tied to mission lands with insecure rights. Christian morality was used to judge or control social behavior. Always the controlling of behavior. Some communities were left land poor and forced into labor migration when missions failed. What's the lessons from this dark side of mission stations? Cultural autonomy matters. Impose civilization often means erasure of culture and traditions. Land security is key. Without ownership, empowerment is fragile. Safe havens that deny independence are not true freedom. Religion offered hope and dignity, but also acted as a colonial disciplining tool. There's the good and the bad that I've presented now of the mission stations. I don't think that there would have been a more cohesive way for people to create what we became. But we mustn't also overlook that it wasn't all sunshine and roses. It's a very conflicting emotion that I have about the mission station. Now I want to move on to someone that when I was reading the book Colored, and yes, I know you guys are tired of hearing this, I read about Gratoa in that book. I read about Sissy Gould and was fascinated. And then I read about this guy, and reading about these people is what really sparked this journey that we are now. I'm mentioning him because it was interesting. I just want to share it with you because I think I've shared it with so many people since I read it. Just going, did you know about this dude? And we are speaking of one John Dunn, a Scotsman who became the first so-called white Zulu. What? Next recount comes directly from the book. Okay. Dunn's family arrived in South Africa and settled in the Eastern Cape. When his father was killed by an elephant, the family returned home, but Dunn married a colored woman named Catherine Pierce and joined an expedition to Natal as a big game hunter and mercenary, taking his chances eastwards. In December 1856, Dunn was leading a commando of Africa and colored policemen in the British government forces when he met King Cetshwayo in battle. They spoke about him actually meeting Cetshwayo's father first in another account that I read up after reading this. But I'm just making sure that this was the account from the book, but I have read at the places that he met the father first. From what I could find, Dunn was fluent in Zulu and well-versed in both African and European ways of life. He became an advisor and diplomatic middleman between the Zulu kingdom and the British. How many times have we seen this? How many times did it end well? These people straddling these multiple worlds and context. I've said it so many times. He's different though, and I'll tell you why, but we'll get there. So going back to Colored, from the book it says, by then he was frustrated with low pay and low rank among the British, and King Cetshwayo, having encountered Dunn's impressive and self-interested negotiation, offered his former enemy a role in his court as advisor. For his defection, Dunn was awarded with a heavily forested area full of wildlife, which he planned to exploit for the ivory trade. It is said elsewhere that he was rewarded not just with land, but with a status rare for Europeans and recognition as a Zulu chief. Coming back to the book Colored, when the Zulu forces were defeated, Dunn's loyalty shifted again, and the land he was awarded became a strategic buffer between the British and the threat of the Boers in the Transvaal. Dunn had the best of both worlds and used this. While he enjoyed the protection of the British, he also cemented his position within Zulu political power, taking 49 Zulu wives. 49! And offering a buffer clan in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. It was a politically expedient move that would set up his descendants for decades. Okay. So the scale of this, right? Some say 49, some say 48 wives, and there's like varying accounts of how many children, but we're going to stick with 117 children. He created one of the largest dynastic networks in South Africa. Overwhelming majority of those children were classified as colored. From my understanding about the little that I've read outside of colored is that there is still a Zulu community that is part of the Dunn clan. After his death in 1895, Dunn clan remained a prominent community, especially in northern KwaZulu-Natal. Today, his descendants, both black and mixed race, form part of South Africa's cultural mosaic. Now, how did he actually make it to death without any major consequences, as we've seen with people who straddle these two worlds? He was engaged in activities that were purely self-serving. He traded firearms, sometimes to both sides of the conflict. His defection was seen by many as a betrayal, a decision that forever stained his reputation in Zulu history. If somebody can confirm. deny, please let me know. But his legacy is debated. Was he a cultural bridge between worlds or simply a man who exploited both for personal gain? The truth may be somewhere in between. I don't think so. No, I think he just exploited it for personal gain. Let me to Judge Judy, executioner. Sorry. Just feels like that, doesn't it? Was it just me? Everybody make up their own mind, decide what you decide. That's what I decided. And that is John Dunn. Interesting, right? Then in 1853 to 1910, we had this Cape qualified franchise. And I was like, how was their franchises back in the day? What does that mean? Did they have shops all over the ship? And then you realize you don't know from anything. This was actually a multiracial vote. And it was one of the most important parts of South African political history, especially for the colored community, because it offered a rare space of relative inclusion, you don't say, in the 19th century before it was systematically stripped away, of course. But let's unpack what made this so amazing. So, the Cape Colony adopted a non-racial franchise system in 1853. Voting rights were based on property and income qualifications, not race. And gender also, because only men could vote. But okay. Any male, regardless of color, could vote if he owned property worth at least £25 or earned wages of at least £50 per year. So in theory, colored, Khoisan, free slave, and Africans could vote alongside white settlers. At a time when most colonies and even Britain restricted voting to whites or Europeans, this must have stood out like a sore thumb. What this offered many colored artisans, teachers, and landowners, especially from those mission stations I just spoke about in Peniel and Genadendal and Mumray. This gave them a stake in politics and a sense of belonging in the colony. Why didn't we change? What happened? It produced early colored and African political organizations, petitions, and activism, because people had the right to participate. So what happened? Okay, now let's go through, because we had a 4-phase approach of just kicking this out completely. Phase 1 was you had the diamond and gold rush. That brought massive African labor migrations and sparking fears that there wouldn't be a majority white vote anymore. White politicians increasingly sought to raise the qualification to limit the non-white voters. Then we had some laws in phase 2, which was legal restrictions. The Cape Parliamentary Registration Act of 1887. This disqualified voters living on communal lands, which then excluded many African farmers and reduced the African electorate dramatically. Then we had the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892, where they raised the property qualification from £25 to £75. Literacy requirement was introduced, so you had to sign your name and write your address. Because of these changes disproportionately excluded coloureds and Africans. By 1890, many poor coloured farmers and mission residents lost the vote. Sneaky. Then the Union of South Africa of 1910. The Cape retains its non-racial franchise, but it only applied to election within the Cape. So when it included the good old Natal, Orange Free State, and Transvaal, it barred those people completely. So that is in the union part. The local part, they could partake, but in the union, which is, union-wide, for Parliament, they couldn't. Then phase 4, systematic removal. So we had the representation of the Native Acts of 1936, which removed Africans from the Cape common voter rolls, placed them on a separate roll with only a few white MPs representing them. kind of them. Coloureds remained, but already weakened. Then there was the Separate Representation of Voter Acts of 1951, enforced in 1956, which completely removed coloured people from the Cape Common role, gave them a segregated role with 4 MPs to represent them. By the mid-1950s, the Cape Qualified Franchise, once the most liberal system in Africa, and I contest the world, was dead and replaced by the full apartheid disenfranchisement. So even though it was eroded over time, what did it create? So for colored communities, it fostered political consciousness and traditions of organization. Leaders like Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman built on the idea that colored people were citizens with rights. Losing the vote fueled anger, alienation, and later resistance under apartheid. The erosion of the Cape Franchise show how early liberal ideals were sacrificed to white supremacy. It was so close, so close. It reveals the fear of majority rule that drove South African politics from the late 19th century to apartheid. It also provides a legal and moral precedent. Activists could point back to it and argue we had rights and they were stolen. The Cape Qualified Franchise was I don't want to call it an experiment. Maybe it was, and they wanted to see how it went, but it was rare in its non-racial democracy, giving coloreds and some African people a political vote after slavery. It was rare. But as mining wealth grew and white settler power grew, it was steadily undermined through property, literacy, and racial exclusions. So even though they worked so hard to get it out of the way, what it did do, and the memory of it, nurtured a strong tradition of political activism. Thank you so much for listening today. Found that somehow really invigorating. It is now 10 p.m. at night, and I am literally wired from doing this episode. There was so much learning for me, and I hope that you found it the same. We spoke about the Cat River settlement, what happened, the mission stations as a community building portion of our history, some of the good, some of the bad, very conflicting emotions on that one. We learned about John Dunn, who I just found very interesting and I wanted to share with you guys. And then last but not least was the Cape Qualified Franchise, which in its essence was great until it was eroded. So come back next week. We'll be talking about more through this 100-year period, significant people that I found interesting. If there's anyone that you want to suggest that I cover, please just let me know in the comments or drop us an email on show@onthebeatentrackpod.com. Yeah, let's see what we get up to next week. Thank you so much. A reminder to please subscribe and never miss an upload from me. And I'll see you in the comments this weekend. Bye.